The prenup was her idea. Let me make that crystal clear from the start, because everything that happened afterward stemmed from that single moment when Vanna Hesslor, soon to be Vanna Ardell, slapped those legal papers down on my kitchen table like she was serving divorce papers before we'd even gotten married. Quote, she said, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany surface. Quote, I understood plenty. I understood that the woman I was about to marry thought I was some kind of gold-digging opportunist, despite the fact that she'd pursued me for 8 months straight. I understood that her law degree from Harvard made her feel superior to my community college IT certification. Most importantly, I understood that she was so afraid I'd take her precious assets that she never bothered to read the fine print of her own contract. That was 3 years ago, back when I still believed love conquered legal documents. The prenup was ironclad, according to her high-priced attorney, a sharp-dressed shark named Peterson, who looked at me like I was something he'd scrape off his Italian leather shoes. Every asset we brought into the marriage would remain separate property. Any future acquisitions would belong to whoever earned them. Even the engagement ring, a modest 2-carat diamond I'd saved 6 months to afford, was classified as her separate property under the agreement. Quote 2. Peterson had explained with barely concealed condescension. Quote 3. I signed it. What choice did I have? I was 32, tired of being alone, and stupid enough to think marriage might change her into someone who actually respected me. 3 years of marriage taught me otherwise. 3 years of subtle put-downs about my so-san quote 4-4, so be work, even though my IT consulting brought in decent money. 3 years of her friends treating me like hired help at dinner parties. 3 years of watching her climb the ladder at Morrison, Kale, and Associates, while making it clear that my success was irrelevant to her grand plans. Then came Tuesday, October 15th, the day everything changed. I was in my home office, a converted bedroom that Vanna barely acknowledged existed, when I checked my phone and saw the notification from the state lottery app. I'd been buying the same numbers for 2 years, not because I believed in luck, but because the routine gave me something to do during my lunch breaks. 5 numbers matched. All 5. $5 million. After taxes, roughly $3.2 million. I stared at the screen for 10 minutes, waiting for it to change, waiting for reality to reassert itself. When it didn't, I did something that would have surprised everyone who knew me. I smiled. Not because of the money, though that was nice. I smiled because I finally had leverage. The first thing I did was call my attorney. Not Peterson. I'd learned my lesson about using Vanna's people. I called Janet Morrison, no relation to Vanna's firm, a scrappy lawyer who'd helped me incorporate my consulting business. Quote 5. Quote 6. Quote 7. There was silence on the other end. Then Janet started laughing. Quote, she said. By the time Vanna got home from work that evening, the money was already secured in 3 separate irrevocable trusts, each one carefully structured to comply with the prenup's future assets clause. The lottery ticket had been in my name. The claim had been filed by me, individually. According to the very agreement Vanna had insisted upon, every penny was my separate property. I was in the kitchen, making my usual Tuesday dinner of grilled chicken and vegetables, when she walked in. Designer heels clicked against the hardwood floors like a countdown timer. You look pleased with yourself, she said, dropping her briefcase by the door. Good day at work? You could say that. I flipped the chicken breast, watching the sizzle. Actually, I have some news. We should probably sit down. Vanna poured herself a glass of the expensive wine she kept for special occasions, wine I wasn't supposed to touch without permission, and settled into her chair at the dining room table. She looked beautiful, as always. Blonde hair perfectly styled, makeup flawless despite a 10-hour workday, suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. What's the news? She asked, already half distracted by her phone. I won the lottery today. Her head snapped up. What? $5 million. Well, 3.2 after taxes. I plated the chicken, added some steamed broccoli. Claimed it this afternoon. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. Vanna's eyes went wide, then calculating. I could practically see the dollar signs reflecting in her pupils. Quote 19. Quote 20. I corrected gently, setting her plate in front of her. Quote 21. The fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Quote 22. Quote 23. I sat down across from her, cutting into my chicken. Quote 24. Quote 25. She started, then stopped. I watched her lawyer brain kick into gear, running through the implications. Quote 26. Quote 27. She set down her fork with enough force to make the plate ring. Quote 28. Quote 29. I took a bite of broccoli, chewed slowly. Quote 30. Vanna stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Quote 31. Quote 32. Quote 33. Quote 34. I finished my chicken, watching her reflection in the window. Quote 35. She whirled around, her face flushed with anger. Quote 36. Quote 37. Quote 38, she said suddenly. Quote 39. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small jewelry box, setting it on the table between us. Quote 40. Vanna's face went pale. Where did you get that? From your jewelry box, while you were at work. I opened the box, revealing the 2-carat diamond that had cost me 6 months of savings. Funny thing about that ring clause in the prenup, it says any gifts given during the engagement period become the separate property of the recipient, unless the engagement is broken by the recipient's actions. What are you talking about? Adultery, Vanna. Section 15, subsection C. If the engagement is terminated due to infidelity on the part of the recipient, all gifts revert to the giver. The color drained from her face completely. I don't know what you're talking about. I pulled out my phone, scrolled to a photo, and placed it on the table next to the ring box. It showed Vanna leaving a downtown hotel with Eli Garrison, the owner of Elite Fitness, the high-end gym where she'd been, quote 47, 3 nights a week for the past 6 months. Quote 48. I continued. Quote 49. Vanna sank back into her chair, staring at the photo. Quote 50. Quote 51. Quote 52. Quote 53. I closed the jewelry box with a soft click. Quote 54. She was quiet for a long time, staring at her untouched dinner. When she finally looked up, there was something different in her eyes, something cold and calculating that I'd seen before, usually right before she destroyed someone who'd crossed her at work. Quote 55, she said softly. Quote 56. Quote 57. The war began the next morning. I woke up to find Vanna already gone, her side of the bed cold and undisturbed. She'd probably left before dawn, which meant she was either at the office plotting with her colleagues or meeting with Peterson to find loopholes in the prenup. Maybe both. My phone had 17 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, plus a handful of texts from friends and acquaintances. Word was already spreading. In a town like Millbrook, $5 million was front-page news, especially when it involved someone married to a lawyer at the most prominent firm in the county. The first text was from Frank Dorsey, my oldest friend and the owner of Murphy's Tavern, the dive bar where I'd spent most of my bachelor nights. Quote 58, I texted back. Quote 59. Quote 60. The next few texts were more complicated. Mutual friends, mostly Vanna's people, expressing congratulations that felt forced and questions that felt like fishing expeditions. I ignored most of them, but one caught my attention. Roxanne Miller, Vanna's best friend and fellow lawyer at Morrison, Kale and Associates. Itoars, quote 61. I stared at that message for a full minute. Roxanne was Vanna's closest confidant, the person she told everything to. If Rox was reaching out to me directly, it meant Vanna was already mobilizing her forces. I called Janet Morrison. How bad is it going to get? I asked without preamble. Honestly, pretty bad. I've already had 2 calls this morning from Peterson's office, and it's not even 9 a.m. They're looking for any angle to break the prenup or claim the lottery money as marital property. Can they do that? Not legally. The agreement is solid, and you followed all the proper procedures for claiming the winnings. But that doesn't mean they won't try to make your life miserable in the process. What kind of miserable? Character assassination, claims of gambling addiction, financial irresponsibility, emotional abuse. They'll paint you as an unstable husband who's using the money to manipulate and control his wife. I laughed, surprising myself. That's rich, coming from someone who made me sign a prenup to protect herself from my supposed gold-digging tendencies. The irony won't be lost on a judge, assuming it gets that far. But public opinion is different from legal opinion. Be prepared for things to get personal. She was right, of course. By noon, my phone was buzzing with calls from local reporters wanting to interview the lottery winner. By 2 p.m., I had 3 friend requests on social media from people I'd never met. By 4 p.m., someone had posted my home address on a local Facebook group, along with speculation about how I was quote, 71 known, my newfound wealth. The first real attack came that evening. I was at Murphy's, nursing a beer and enjoying the relative anonymity of Frank's dimly lit bar, when Roxanne Miller walked in. She looked around the room like she was entering a contaminated area, her designer suit and perfect makeup completely out of place among the construction workers and retirees who made up Frank's regular clientele. "Trent," she said, sliding onto the bar stool next to mine, "we need to talk." "So you said in your text." Frank appeared from behind the bar, wiping his hands on a towel. "What can I get you, lady?" "Nothing, thank you. I'm not staying long." Roxanne turned to face me, her expression serious. "Trent, what you're doing to Vanna is cruel." "What I'm doing? I'm not doing anything except following the legal agreement she insisted on." "You're using a technicality to steal money that rightfully belongs to both of you." "I'm using the law. You know that thing you lawyers are supposed to respect?" Roxanne's jaw tightened. Quote 81. Quote 82. I took a long sip of beer, letting the silence stretch. Quote 83. Quote 84. Quote 85. I set down my beer and turned to face her fully. Quote 86. She hesitated, which told me everything I needed to know. Quote 87. I continued. Quote 88. Quote 89. Quote 90. Roxanne stood up, smoothing down her skirt. Quote 91. Quote 92. She left without another word, her heels clicking against the worn wooden floor. Frank waited until the door closed behind her before speaking. Quote 93. He said. Quote 94. But as I finished my beer and drove home through the quiet suburban streets of Millbrook, I couldn't shake the feeling that Roxanne's visit had been more than just a friendly intervention. It felt like a reconnaissance mission, a way to gauge my resolve and gather intelligence for whatever Vanna was planning next. I was right to be suspicious. When I got home, I found my garage door open and my workshop ransacked. Tools scattered across the floor, drawers pulled out, papers everywhere. Nothing seemed to be missing, but everything had been searched. On my workbench, held down by a wrench, was a note in Vanna's handwriting. "Looking for something?" I smiled despite myself. She was fishing, trying to find evidence of hidden assets or secret accounts that might give her leverage in a potential legal battle. What she didn't understand was that I'd been preparing for this moment for months, ever since I'd first suspected her affair. Every document was already with Janet Morrison. Every asset was properly documented and protected. Every move I'd made had been calculated and deliberate. But Vanna's little breaking and entering expedition told me something important. She was desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. I pulled out my phone and called Janet. Quote 96. I said. Quote 97. Quote 90. Quote 99. Quote 100. Quote 10. The police report was filed by Detective Rebecca Lorne, a no-nonsense woman in her early 40s who'd gone to high school with me back when Millbrook was still small enough for everyone to know everyone else's business. She took photos of the ransacked workshop, dusted for fingerprints, and listened to my account of recent events with the kind of professional detachment that suggested she'd already heard the gossip. "Any idea who might have done this?" she asked, though we both knew the answer. "My wife and I are having some marital difficulties," I said carefully. "Related to your recent lottery win?" "Among other things." Detective Lorne closed her notebook and looked around the garage one more time. "Trent, I'm going to give you some unofficial advice. Whatever's going on between you and Vanna, keep it legal. This town loves drama, but it hates scandal. Don't give people a reason to choose sides." "I'm not the one breaking into houses, Detective." "No, but you're the one with $5 million. That makes you a target, and it makes every move you make newsworthy." She handed me her card. "Call me if anything else happens. And Trent, be careful. Money changes people, sometimes in ways they don't expect." After she left, I spent the rest of the evening cleaning up the workshop and thinking about her words. Money changes people. She was right, of course, but not in the way she meant. The money hadn't changed me. It had revealed who I'd always been underneath the polite, accommodating husband Vanna thought she'd married. I was methodical, patient, and when pushed, I pushed back twice as hard. The next morning brought a new development. I woke up to find my car keyed, long scratches running along both sides from bumper to bumper. The word, quote 110 Yetres, was carved into the hood in letters 6 inches tall. I took pictures, called Detective Lorne, and filed another report. Then I called my insurance company and arranged for repairs. The whole process took less than 2 hours, and I handled it with the kind of calm efficiency that seemed to frustrate everyone around me. Vanna was expecting me to lose my temper, to do something stupid that would give her ammunition in whatever legal battle she was planning. Instead, I documented everything and stayed within the law. But that didn't mean I was passive. Elite Fitness was located in a converted warehouse on the expensive side of town, all glass and chrome and motivational posters featuring impossibly fit models. Eli Garrison had opened it 3 years earlier with money from his trust fund, positioning it as the premier workout destination for Millbrook's professional class. I'd never set foot in the place before, but I knew enough about Eli to understand his weaknesses. He was vain, insecure despite his inherited wealth, and desperately concerned with his image in the community. The kind of man who drove a different luxury car every few months and made sure everyone knew how much it cost. I parked across the street and watched the morning routine. Eli arrived at 7 a.m. sharp in a red Ferrari that probably cost more than most people's houses. He spent 10 minutes in the parking lot, checking his reflection in the car's mirrors and adjusting his expensive workout clothes before going inside. At 8 a.m., the morning rush began. Lawyers, doctors, real estate agents, all the people who could afford Elite's premium membership fees. I recognized several faces, including 2 partners from Vanna's law firm and the mayor's wife. I waited until 9:30, when the morning crowd had thinned out, before crossing the street. The interior of Elite Fitness was exactly what I'd expected. Gleaming equipment, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a juice bar that probably charged $15 for a protein shake. Eli was behind the front desk, chatting with a blonde woman in yoga pants who was hanging on his every word. He looked up when I walked in, and I saw the exact moment he recognized me. His face went pale, then flushed red. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm thinking about joining," I said. "I hear you have excellent personal training services." The blonde woman looked between us, sensing tension but not understanding its source. Eli forced a smile. Of course. Let me give you a tour of the facilities." He led me away from the front desk, past rows of treadmills and weight machines, toward a quieter section of the gym. When we were out of earshot of other members, he stopped and turned to face me. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want you to stay away from my wife." "I don't know what you're talking about." I pulled out my phone and showed him the same photo I'd shown Vanna, the 2 of them leaving the downtown hotel together. Quote 118. Eli glanced around nervously, making sure no one was watching. Quote 119. Quote 120. Quote 121. Quote 122. His jaw tightened. Quote 123. Quote 124. I left him standing there among the exercise equipment, his face red with anger and embarrassment. As I walked back through the main gym area, I noticed several people watching me with curious expressions. Word would spread quickly in a place like Elite Fitness, where gossip was as much a part of the workout routine as cardio and weights. That afternoon, I got a call from Vanna. Welcome to quote 125, as she demanded without preamble. How's quote 126? Don't want to quote 127. 128. Look quote 129. That she laughed bitterly. Look quote 130. Look quote 131. Quote 132. Look quote 133. There was silence on the other end of the line. Look quote 134. Chakral quote 135. She asked quietly. Quote 136. Quote 137. She hung up without responding. The escalation came 3 days later, and it was more vicious than I'd expected. I was having lunch at Millbrook Deli when I overheard 2 women at the next table discussing my gambling problem and how I'd been ASD, quote 139, throughout my marriage. They spoke in the loud whispers people use when they want to be overheard, and they made sure to glance in my direction every few sentences. By the time I got back to my office, a small suite I rented above the hardware store, I had 6 voicemails from potential clients canceling their contracts. Apparently, they'd heard I was unstable and going through a difficult time that might affect my work quality. I called Janet Morrison. "They're trying to destroy my business," I said. "Can you prove it?" "Not directly, but the timing is suspicious, and the complaints are all variations of the same theme. Someone's been spreading stories about my mental state and professional reliability. Document everything. Save the voicemails, keep records of canceled contracts, write down any conversations you have about this. If we can establish a pattern of defamation, we might have grounds for a civil suit." "Against who?" "Vanna's too smart to put anything in writing, and her friends are all lawyers. They know how to spread rumors without leaving fingerprints." "Then we need to be smarter than they are." That evening, I drove to Murphy's Tavern for what had become my regular decompression session. Frank had a beer waiting before I even sat down. Quote, 148. He asked. Quote, 9. Quote, 150. Quote, said 51, the endful, or quote, 152. Frank had been my friend since high school, back when we were both more interested in cars and girls than careers and mortgages. He'd inherited Murphy's from his father and turned it into the kind of neighborhood bar where everyone knew your name and your business, but kept both to themselves unless invited to share. Quote, 153. Frank said, wiping down glasses with practiced efficiency. Quote, 154. Mrs. Blanchard was our 70-year-old neighbor, a retired librarian with the observational skills of a private investigator and the discretion of a town crier. If she was talking to Frank, it meant she had information to share. Quote, 155. Quote, 156. Quote, 157. Quote, 158. Frank handed me a slip of paper with the plate number written in Mrs. Blanchard's careful handwriting. I recognized the first 3 letters. They indicated a rental car from the agency near the airport. They're building a case, I said. For what? I don't know yet, but people don't hire professional photographers to document someone's lifestyle unless they're planning to use the photos for something specific. I finished my beer and drove home through streets that felt different now, less familiar and more hostile. Every car that passed seemed to slow down as it approached my house. Every neighbor I saw in their yard seemed to watch me with new interest. Vanna's car was in the driveway when I arrived, which surprised me. She'd been staying at Roxanne's apartment for the past week, coming home only to collect clothes and personal items. Her presence meant either a peace offering or a declaration of war. I found her in the living room, sitting on the couch with a stack of papers in her lap and a laptop open on the coffee table. She looked up when I entered, her expression unreadable. Quote, 162. She said. Quote, 163. Quote, 164. I sat down in the chair across from her, maintaining distance. Quote, 165. Quote, 166. Quote, 167. Quote, 168. She sounded sincere, but sincerity had never been Vanna's problem. She could be genuinely sorry for hurting someone while simultaneously planning to hurt them again if it served her purposes. What are you proposing? A reset. We split the lottery money 50-50, we go to marriage counseling, we start over. She leaned forward, her voice taking on the persuasive tone she used in court. Trent, we can make this work. We just need to be honest with each other. Honest? About everything. My affair with Eli, your resentment about the prenup, the way we've been living parallel lives instead of building something together. It was a good speech, well-rehearsed and emotionally compelling. If I hadn't known her as well as I did, I might have been tempted to believe it. Quote, 174. I asked. Quote, 175. Quote, 176. Her face flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been guilt. And quote, 177. Quote, 178. Then quote, 179, and quote, 180. We stared at each other across the coffee table, the pretense of reconciliation evaporating like morning fog. Quote, 181, thought she said finally. Quote, 182, and quote, 183, and quote, 184, quote, 185, and quote, 186. There it was. The real strategy laid out with lawyerly precision. If she couldn't break the prenup, she'd try to have me declared mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. Quote, 187. I asked. Quote, 188. And quote, 189. I stood up, suddenly tired of the whole conversation. Seen quote, 109 get quote 191, 190, quote 192, quote 193. I stopped at the doorway and looked back at her. It quote 194, quote 195, quote 196. Yet I left her sitting in the living room, surrounded by her legal documents and strategic plans. As I packed clothes and toiletries, I could hear her on the phone, her voice low and urgent. She was already mobilizing her forces for the next phase of the war, but as I loaded my suitcase into my car and drove toward Frank's place, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. For the first time in my marriage, I was playing offense instead of defense, and I was just getting started. Frank's apartment above Murphy's Tavern was small, cluttered, and smelled like beer and old leather, but it felt more like home than the house I'd shared with Vanna for 3 years. He'd cleared out his spare room without questions or judgment, accepting my explanation that I needed some space while things got sorted out. Quote, 197. He asked as I set my suitcase down. Quote, 198. Quote, 199. Quote, 200. Frank opened 2 beers and handed me one. Quote, 201. Quote, 200. The next morning brought confirmation that Vanna had chosen the nuclear option. I was having coffee in Frank's kitchen when Janet Morrison called with news that made my day considerably more interesting. "They filed a petition for guardianship," she said without preamble. "What does that mean?" "It means they're asking the court to declare you mentally incompetent to manage your own affairs due to sudden wealth syndrome and associated psychological disorders." I laughed, surprising myself. Sudden wealth syndrome, that's a real thing? Unfortunately, yes. It's a recognized psychological condition that can affect lottery winners and inheritance recipients. The symptoms include anxiety, paranoia, social isolation, and impaired judgment. And they think I have it? They have 3 witnesses prepared to testify that you've exhibited erratic behavior, made threats against your wife's associate, and shown signs of gambling addiction and financial irresponsibility. Let me guess, Roxanne Miller, Eli Garrison, and someone from Peterson's office. Close. Roxanne, Eli, and Dr. Patricia Vance, a psychiatrist who specializes in wealth-related psychological disorders. A psychiatrist who's never met me. That's the beauty of their strategy. Dr. Vance will testify about the general symptoms of sudden wealth syndrome, establishing that it's a real condition that affects real people. Then Roxanne and Eli will testify about specific behaviors they've observed that match those symptoms. I took a long sip of coffee, processing the implications. How strong is their case? Legally? Weak. You'd have to be genuinely incapacitated for a guardianship petition to succeed, and there's no evidence of that. But politically, it's brilliant. Even if they lose, they'll have created a public narrative about your mental state that could affect everything from your business relationships to your social standing. So what do? We fight back, but we fight smart. Janet's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of just defending against Vanna's attacks, we would go on offense using the same legal system she was trying to weaponize against me. The first step was a restraining order based on the break-in at my house and the ongoing harassment campaign. The second was a defamation suit against Roxanne Miller for her statements about my mental health and professional competency. The third was a motion to have Dr. Vance's testimony excluded on grounds that she had no direct knowledge of my psychological state. Quote 218. Janet explained. Dalitsi quote 219, quote 1020, 10 quote 1021. I pulled out my copy of the prenup and found the relevant section. Quote 1022, quote 1023, quote 1024, quote 1025. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday, which gave us 5 days to prepare our counterattack. I spent the time documenting every aspect of the harassment campaign, from the canceled business contracts to the professional photographer who'd been documenting my house. The photographer turned out to be particularly interesting. His name was Marcus Webb, and he worked for a private investigation firm that specialized in asset searches and surveillance for divorce attorneys. According to his invoice, which Janet obtained through discovery, he'd been hired to document my already rank, quote, 226, Maurice, for the past 2 weeks. Or, quote, 227, Janet explained, quote, 228, quote, 229, one, and then, quote, 230, word, quote, 231, that, quote, 232. The night before the hearing, I had dinner at Murphy's with Frank and Detective Rebecca Lorne, who'd become an unofficial advisor on the legal aspects of the harassment campaign. The bar was busier than usual, filled with people who kept glancing in my direction and whispering among themselves. Quote 233. Detective Lorne observed. Quote 234. Quote 235. Frank refilled our drinks and leaned against the bar. Quote 236. Quote 237. Detective Lorne said. Quote 238. Quote 239. Quote 240. She was right, of course. Already I could see the effects of the public battle on both sides. Vanna looked exhausted and stressed whenever I saw her around town. Her friends were avoiding me completely, crossing the street or leaving establishments when I arrived. The whole community was being forced to choose between us, creating divisions that would last long after our legal battle was resolved. But I was past the point of caring about public opinion. Vanna had chosen to make this a public spectacle when she could have handled it privately. Now she would have to live with the consequences. The morning of the hearing, I put on my best suit and met Janet at the courthouse. The building was older than most of Millbrook, a red brick structure that had been the center of local government for over a century. The family court was on the second floor, a wood-paneled room with tall windows and an American flag hanging behind the judge's bench. Judge Patricia Hendricks was in her 50s, a former family law attorney who'd been appointed to the bench 5 years earlier. She had a reputation for fairness and intolerance for legal gamesmanship, which Janet considered a good sign. Vanna was already seated at the petitioner's table with Peterson and 2 other attorneys I didn't recognize. She looked professional and composed, every inch the successful lawyer fighting to protect her unstable husband from his own poor judgment. The hearing began with Peterson's opening statement, a carefully crafted narrative about my transformation from a loving husband into a paranoid, vindictive man obsessed with money and revenge. He painted a picture of someone who'd been psychologically damaged by sudden wealth and was now making irrational decisions that threatened both my own welfare and that of my wife. Quote 241. Peterson concluded. Quote 2422. Janet's response was swift and brutal. Your Honor, this petition is not about protecting Mr. Ardell from psychological harm. It's about punishing him for refusing to share lottery winnings that belonged to him under a prenuptial agreement that Mrs. Ardell herself insisted upon. The petitioner is asking this court to declare her husband mentally incompetent because he won't give her money she has no legal right to claim. The first witness was Dr. Patricia Vance, the psychiatrist who'd never met me but was prepared to testify about my mental state. She was professional and articulate, explaining the symptoms of sudden wealth syndrome and how they could affect judgment and decision-making ability. Quote 244. She testified. Quote 245. Janet's cross-examination was masterful. Dr. Vance, have you ever met Mr. Ardell? No, I have not. Have you conducted any psychological evaluation of Mr. Ardell? No, but have you reviewed any medical records, psychological assessments, or other clinical data related to Mr. Ardell's mental health? No, but the reported behaviors are consistent with. So your testimony is based entirely on secondhand accounts of behavior described to you by Mrs. Ardell's attorneys? The symptoms described are consistent with sudden wealth syndrome. Dr. Vance, if I told you that someone had won $5 million and then taken steps to protect that money from people who wanted to take it away, would you consider that paranoid behavior or reasonable financial planning? Peterson objected, but Judge Hendricks allowed the question. It would depend on the specific circumstances, Dr. Vance answered carefully. And without examining the patient directly, you couldn't make that determination, could you? Not definitively, no. The next witness was Roxanne Miller, who testified about my erratic behavior and threatening statements toward Eli Garrison. She described me as increasingly isolated, paranoid, and obsessed with revenge against my wife. Janet's cross-examination revealed the weakness in her testimony. Quote 260, quote 261, quote 262, quote 263, quote 264. Peterson objected, but Judge Hendricks overruled him. Quote 265, quote 266, quote 267, quote 268, quote 269, quote 270 as a quote 271. Roxanne's face flushed red. I was trying to understand what was happening to him. Or trying to build a case against him? The final witness was Eli Garrison, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. His testimony about my charm, quote 274, chowdi at his gym was technically accurate but lacked the emotional impact Peterson had probably hoped for. Janet's cross-examination was brief and devastating. Mr. Garrison, you've been having an affair with Mrs. Ardell for approximately 6 months, correct? Yes or no, Mr. Garrison? Yes. And this affair continued even after Mr. Ardell discovered it and asked you to end it? Yes. So when Mr. Ardell told you to stay away from his wife, you considered that a threat rather than a reasonable request from a betrayed husband? He was aggressive. As aggressive as someone who continues an affair with another man's wife despite being asked to stop? Peterson objected, but the damage was done. Eli looked like exactly what he was, a privileged man-child who'd been caught doing something wrong and was now trying to make himself the victim. When it was our turn to present evidence, Janet called Detective Lauren to testify about the break-in at my house and the ongoing harassment campaign. Then she called Frank to testify about my character and behavior, painting a picture of someone who was handling a difficult situation with remarkable restraint and dignity. Finally, she called me to the stand. It's quote 284, Charts quote 285, Okwononi quote 286, Goimedi quote 287, Tantorn di quote 287, Inkwandi quote 289, Sid per quote 221, Tekon quote 221, can quote 222, quote 293. Yet Peterson's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. He tried to paint me as vindictive and obsessed, but I answered every question calmly and rationally, demonstrating exactly the kind of mental competence that undermined his entire case. Judge Hendricks took a brief recess before delivering her ruling. When she returned, her expression was stern. This court finds no evidence that Mr. Ardell is mentally incompetent to manage his own affairs. The petition for guardianship is denied. She paused, looking directly at Peterson. Furthermore, this court is troubled by the apparent attempt to use the legal system to circumvent a valid prenuptial agreement. Mr. Ardell's decision to protect assets that belong to him under that agreement is not evidence of mental illness, it's evidence of sound judgment. As we left the courthouse, Janet was practically glowing with satisfaction. That wasn't just a victory, she said. That was a rout. But I knew the war wasn't over. Vanna had lost this battle, but she still had other options. The question was how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted. I didn't have to wait long for an answer. The retaliation came that same evening, swift and vicious. I was at Murphy's, celebrating the court victory with Frank and a handful of regulars who'd become unofficial supporters over the past few weeks. The mood was light, almost festive, with people buying rounds and offering congratulations on my legal triumph. Then Eli Garrison walked in. He looked different from the polished gym owner who'd testified that morning. His expensive clothes were wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his face carried the kind of desperate anger that comes from public humiliation. He scanned the room until his eyes found mine, then walked directly to my table. Quote 228, he said, loud enough for the entire bar to hear. Quote 299. I replied calmly. Dunton, quote 300. Quote 3011. Eli laughed bitterly. Quote 302. Quote 3033. Frank appeared at Eli's shoulder, his bartender's instincts sensing trouble. Quote 304, he suggested quietly. Quote 305. Eli turned back to me, his voice rising. Quote 306. He left without another word, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. Several patrons watched him go, then turned to me with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Quote 30. Frank asked. Quote 308. I was right. The next morning, I woke up to find my car vandalized again, this time with all 4 tires slashed and the windows broken. But that was just the opening move. By noon, someone had posted my home address, phone number, and personal information on 3 different social media platforms, along with accusations that I was a Dutch, quote 309, Chow Fu, who was a quote 310, Daryl, my wife. The posts included photos of my house, my car, and even a picture of me leaving Murphy's the night before. By evening, I'd received dozens of hostile phone calls and emails from strangers who'd been convinced that I was some kind of monster. Someone threw eggs at my house. Someone else left a bag of dog waste on my front porch. Detective Lauren took the report with professional efficiency, but I could see the concern in her eyes. This is escalating beyond a simple domestic dispute, she said. Someone's trying to incite harassment against you. Can you trace the social media posts? We're trying, but they were posted from anonymous accounts using public Wi-Fi. Whoever did this knew how to cover their tracks. Any advice? Stay visible. Don't give them any reason to claim you're behaving erratically or dangerously. And document everything. That night, I moved back into my own house. Staying at Frank's had been a strategic retreat, but retreating further would send the wrong message. I installed security cameras, changed the locks, and prepared for whatever came next. What came next was a masterpiece of legal warfare. Janet called me the following morning with news that made my coffee taste like ash. I want to quote 317, she said. Quote 318, quote 319, quote 330, quote 321. I racked my brain trying to place the name. Turmeric quote 322 and tuning quote 323, quote 324, then quote 325. I sat down heavily, the scope of their strategy becoming clear, and quote 326 sounded quote 30.7 to quote 328 down quote 329. The next few days were a blur of legal preparation and damage control. Janet hired a private investigator to look into Jennifer Walsh and the Red Door. I provided bank records, credit card statements, and phone records to prove I'd never been to the bar or contacted the supposed witness. Meanwhile, the harassment campaign continued. Someone spray-painted cheater on my garage door. My business phone rang constantly with hostile calls. A local blogger wrote a lengthy post about toxic masculinity and financial abuse that mentioned me by name. The breaking point came on Friday evening. I was working late in my home office, reviewing legal documents and trying to make sense of the fabricated evidence against me, when I heard a car door slam outside. Through my window, I saw Vanna walking up the front path, her face set in the kind of determined expression that usually preceded major confrontations. I met her at the door before she could knock. "What do you want, Vanna?" "To end this. All of it." She looked exhausted, older than her 32 years, with dark circles under her eyes and stress lines around her mouth. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. "I'm listening." 50-50 split of the lottery money. I drop the divorce petition, you drop any claims related to my relationship with Eli, we both walk away and start over. "What about Jennifer Walsh and my supposed affair?" Something flickered across her face. Guilt, maybe, or shame. That would go away too. Because it's fabricated? Because it's not relevant if we settle out of court? I stepped aside and led her into the house, leading her to the living room where this whole mess had started weeks earlier. She sat on the same couch where she'd made her first offer, but everything else had changed. Quote 3-1, I said, settling into the chair across from her. On a quote 3-4-2. Quote 3-4-3. Quote 3-4-4-4. Vanna leaned forward, her lawyer instincts taking over. Quote 3-4-5. Quote 3-46. Quote 3-47. She started, then stopped. The quote 3-4-8. Quote 3-49. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her in months. "I was scared," she said quietly. "When you won that money, I realized how much I'd been taking you for granted, how much I'd hurt you, and instead of apologizing, instead of trying to make it right, I panicked and tried to force you to share it." "Why?" "Because I thought if we were financially tied together, you wouldn't leave me." It was the most honest thing she'd said since this whole mess started, and it broke my heart a little. Because underneath all the legal maneuvering and public drama was a simple truth. We'd both been afraid of being alone, and that fear had turned us into people we didn't recognize. Quote 3-5. I said. Quote 3-5. Quote 356. Quote 357. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup. Quote 3-58. Quote 349. Quote 360. I looked at my wife, really looked at her for the first time in months. Underneath the lawyer's armor and the defensive anger was the woman I'd fallen in love with, vulnerable and scared and desperately trying to hold on to something that was already gone. Quote 361. I said honestly. Quote 362. Quote 363. Quote 364. She stood up slowly, gathering her purse and her dignity. Quote 365. Quote 3. She's it. After she left, I sat in the quiet house and thought about the road that had brought us to this point. Two people who'd once loved each other enough to promise forever, now locked in a legal battle that was destroying everything they'd built together. But I was past the point of regret. Vanna had made her choices, and I'd made mine. Now we'd both have to live with the consequences. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Janet Morrison. Quote 367, she said. Quote 368. Quote 369, tapos in quote 370, quote 370E1. I smiled for the first time in days. Quote 372, quote 373, then quote 374, quote 375, and quote 376, quote 377. I thought about Vanna's visit, her tears, her apparent regret. Had it been genuine remorse or just another manipulation? What do you recommend? We expose everything. File criminal complaints against Roxanne, demand sanctions against Peterson for filing false affidavits, and make sure everyone involved faces consequences for their actions. And Vanna? Let the chips fall where they may. She made her choices, Trent. Now she gets to live with them. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Clarity. The fog of anger and confusion was lifting, replaced by a cold, hard determination to see this through to the end. Vanna had asked what kind of person I was going to be. Now she was about to find out. The criminal charges were filed on Monday morning. Roxanne Miller was arrested at her office, led away in handcuffs while her colleagues watched in shocked silence. The charges included perjury, obstruction of justice, criminal conspiracy, and witness tampering. Her law license was suspended pending investigation. Peterson faced professional sanctions for filing false affidavits and failing to verify the credibility of his witnesses. The State Bar Association opened an investigation into his conduct that would eventually result in a 6-month suspension and mandatory ethics training. Vanna was not charged criminally, but the revelation that her best friend had fabricated evidence in her divorce case destroyed what remained of her professional reputation. Morrison, Kale, and Associates placed her on administrative leave pending their own internal investigation. Most of her clients transferred to other attorneys. Eli Garrison's gym closed permanently after several members canceled their memberships and his landlord refused to renew his lease. He left town shortly afterward, reportedly moving back in with his parents in another state. The divorce was finalized 3 months later on terms that heavily favored me. Vanna received no spousal support, paid my legal fees, and had no claim to any portion of the lottery winnings. She moved back in with her parents and began looking for work at smaller firms in other cities. As for me, I kept the money, rebuilt my business, and learned to live with the fact that sometimes winning means everyone else has to lose. The prenup that was supposed to protect Vanna from my greed ended up protecting me from hers. The clause she'd insisted upon became the weapon that destroyed her. Justice, it turned out, had a sense of irony. I never did spend much of the lottery money. Most of it sits in carefully managed investments, earning modest returns, and providing security for a future I'm building on my own terms. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if Vanna had simply been honest from the beginning, if she'd treated me as an equal partner instead of a potential threat. But that's the thing about choices. Once you make them, you can't unmake them. You can only live with the consequences and hope you learned something along the way. The clause was ironclad, just like Peterson had promised. So was the payback.